I was surrounded by friends and family, celebrating one of the happiest moments of my life, when my mother-in-law suddenly stood up, tapped her glass, and with a smirk, announced that my husband was cheating on me. Gasps filled the room as she handed me printed screenshots, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You deserve to know," she said, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. But she had no idea that I already knew the truth, because when I pulled out my phone and showed her the real texts, the color drained from her face. Within minutes, she was the one running out in tears. "Hi, my name is Olivia, and up until my baby shower, I thought my biggest worry was picking the perfect nursery color, debating between soft blues and warm neutrals, obsessing over crib designs, and making sure everything was perfect before my son arrived. I had been married to my husband, Jake, for 3 years, and despite the usual ups and downs, our relationship had always been solid. We were happy, we were excited for our baby, and we were surrounded by family and friends who were just as eager to celebrate this new chapter in our lives. But there was one person in my life who had never truly been in my corner, someone who had spent years making it painfully clear that she didn't think I belonged in her son's life, my mother-in-law, Diane. Diane had never liked me, though she was always careful to mask her disdain behind forced politeness and backhanded compliments, never outright saying she disapproved, but always finding ways to make me feel like I wasn't good enough. She was the type of woman who thrived on control, who wanted Jake to marry someone she approved of, someone who fit into her perfect, carefully curated version of what their family should be. And from the moment she met me, she had been looking for ways to push me out, subtly at first, then more boldly as time went on. But even with her history of manipulation, even with the years of tension between us, I never thought she would go as far as this. The baby shower had been nothing short of perfect, a beautiful afternoon filled with pastel decorations, soft music, and the warmth of people who had come to celebrate our growing family. I was surrounded by my closest friends, my mom, my sister, and the women who had supported me throughout my pregnancy, all of us laughing, opening gifts, and soaking in the joy of the moment. Everything was perfect, until I heard the sharp clink of a champagne glass being tapped, the universal signal for attention, and turned to see Diane standing tall in the middle of the room, a smug smile playing on her lips as she cleared her throat with deliberate slowness. "I wasn't sure if I should say this," she began, tilting her head in a way that was meant to look sympathetic but only made my stomach tighten. "But as a mother, I feel Olivia deserves to know the truth." The entire room fell into silence, the kind of stillness that only happens when something truly awful is about to be said, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a warning before the storm hits. My heart pounded as I instinctively reached for Jake's hand, but he wasn't standing beside me. He had stepped out a few minutes earlier to take a call. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as Diane reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers, fanning them out like a winning hand in a game I hadn't even realized I was playing. "Jake has been cheating on you," she announced, her voice steady, loud, triumphant, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she was proud of what she was doing, as if she was waiting for gasps of horror, for murmurs of sympathy, for the validation of an audience she had so carefully chosen. A collective inhale rippled through the room, shocked whispers spreading like wildfire as Diane took a slow, deliberate step toward me, holding the stack of papers out with the air of a woman handing over evidence in a courtroom. I could feel my best friend, Sarah, stiffen beside me, could see my mother's face pale, could hear the sharp intake of breath from the women who had spent the afternoon laughing and celebrating with me just moments ago. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the papers, but not because I was hurt. No, I wasn't hurt. I was furious. I scanned the pages quickly, my eyes flicking over the familiar text messages, my stomach twisting, but not in pain. In rage. Because I had seen these messages before. In fact, I knew exactly where they had come from. The messages were real, that much was true. But what Diane didn't know, what she hadn't counted on, what was about to completely destroy whatever plan she had so smugly crafted, was that I already knew the full story. And the truth? It was about to make Diane regret every single second of this ridiculous performance. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room watching me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the tears, waiting for the dramatic breakdown Diane clearly thought she had orchestrated so perfectly, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of the revelation she believed would destroy my marriage. My hands trembled slightly as I held the papers, but not because I was hurt, not because I was heartbroken, not because she had successfully shattered the trust between me and my husband. No, I was furious, blindingly furious, dangerously furious, the kind of fury that simmers just beneath the surface, sharp and controlled, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I slowly lifted my gaze, locking eyes with Diane, who was standing there with a self-satisfied smirk, soaking in the attention, basking in the anticipation of my humiliation, completely oblivious to the fact that she was moments away from experiencing her own. I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to remain calm, to keep my voice measured, to let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable, to make her start questioning whether this was going the way she had imagined. "Where did you get these?" I asked finally, my tone eerily steady, my expression giving nothing away, watching as a flicker of uncertainty passed through her eyes before she quickly masked it with even more arrogance. Her smirk widened, her confidence growing as if she had already won, as if she truly believed I was about to break. "A friend sent them to me," she said smoothly, her voice laced with feigned concern, her shoulders lifting in a nonchalant shrug, as if it were just a minor inconvenience to publicly detonate my marriage at my own baby shower. "I thought you should know before you make the mistake of raising a child with a man who doesn't respect you." There was a sharp intake of breath from the guests, the weight of her words settling over the room like a thick fog, choking out the warmth and joy that had existed only moments ago. I could feel my best friend, Sarah, tense beside me, her fingers twitching like she was ready to snatch the papers out of my hands and throw them straight into Diane's smug face. My mother looked absolutely horrified, one hand covering her mouth as she shot Jake a look of pure disbelief, clearly waiting for him to say something, anything, to deny the accusation that had just been laid out so carelessly. And then, finally, Jake snapped out of his frozen state, his body going rigid beside me, his fists clenching at his sides, his voice sharp and filled with a kind of anger I had never heard from him before. "Mom, what the hell is wrong with you?" he said, his words cutting through the thick silence, his disbelief evident in every syllable. He took a step forward, his entire body radiating fury, but before he could say anything else, before he could give Diane the screaming match she was likely hoping for, I reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling for him to let me handle it. I turned back to Diane, studying her carefully, watching the way her lips twitched, watching the way she held her chin just a little too high, watching the way her fingers gripped the stem of her champagne glass just a little too tightly. She thought she had won, thought she had just burned my marriage to the ground, thought she had successfully inserted herself into a place of power where she could swoop in and console her son once the inevitable fallout occurred. But what she didn't know, what she had never anticipated, was that I had come prepared. With a slow, knowing smile, I reached for my phone, my fingers moving effortlessly as I unlocked the screen, keeping my gaze locked onto hers, letting her see the unwavering confidence in my eyes. "That's interesting," I said, my voice light, casual, almost amused as I scrolled through my messages, as I found exactly what I was looking for, as I prepared to completely shatter the smug satisfaction on her face. I turned the screen slightly, just enough for her to see the name on the conversation thread, just enough to make her breath hitch, just enough to plant the first seeds of panic. Because I know exactly where these messages came from. The smug look on Diane's face wavered as I scrolled through my messages, my fingers steady, my pulse calm, my mind racing through everything I was about to expose. She had walked into this room so certain that she was the one in control, so confident that she had orchestrated the perfect moment to publicly humiliate me, so convinced that she had all the proof she needed to destroy my marriage beyond repair. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated me. She had assumed I would panic, assumed I would break down in front of my friends and family, assumed I would take her word as fact without question. And because of that assumption, she had failed to do the one thing that would have saved her from this moment. She had failed to check her own evidence. I let the silence stretch between us, let her sit in her growing discomfort, let her feel the weight of the moment slipping out of her grasp. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I turned my phone screen toward her, watching closely as her expression shifted from smugness to confusion, from confusion to realization, from realization to panic. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly as her eyes darted across the screen, desperately trying to make sense of what she was seeing, desperately trying to piece together how this was happening, desperately trying to find some way to backpedal before it was too late. "Let me tell you what actually happened," I said, my voice calm but firm, my gaze never leaving hers. I tapped the screen, scrolling further, revealing the full conversation thread, the actual messages that Diane had so conveniently ignored. The screenshots she had printed and so proudly waved in front of the entire party? They were real, yes, but they weren't for my husband. They were from his best friend, Brandon, who had been helping Jake plan a surprise anniversary trip for me. The messages, when taken out of context, looked bad, cryptic phrases about hotel reservations, secretive talks about weekend getaways, vague mentions of making sure Olivia doesn't find out, but anyone who actually read the full conversation would see that it had nothing to do with cheating. It had everything to do with Jake trying to surprise me with something beautiful. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as Diane's triumphant smirk completely disappeared, as the weight of her miscalculations settled onto her shoulders, as she realized that she had just humiliated herself in front of every single person she had hoped to impress. The color drained from her face, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass, her breathing coming just a little bit faster, her mind scrambling for some way, anyway, to turn this back around. But there was no way to fix this. No excuse that could undo what she had just done. No justification for how badly she had embarrassed herself in front of everyone she had so desperately wanted to manipulate. "You didn't think to check the timestamps, did you, Diane?" I asked, my voice dripping with satisfaction, my eyes sharp with the kind of confidence she had never wanted me to have. I watched as her lips parted, as if she wanted to respond, as if she wanted to come up with some last-minute defense, but no words came. She knew she had lost. I let out a slow exhale, watching her squirm, watching the guests around us shift uncomfortably, watching as whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Diane had walked into this room believing she was the smartest person here, believing she had orchestrated the perfect downfall, believing she had finally gotten rid of me once and for all. But all she had really done was expose herself, reveal just how desperate she was to break us apart, just how far she was willing to go to poison her son against the woman he loved. These messages were between Brandon and Jake, discussing which hotel to book for our anniversary. I continued, my tone sharp, cutting through the stunned silence in the room. "You know, the one Jake's been secretly planning for months?" I could feel the energy shift around us, could hear the murmurs growing louder, could see the way Diane's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her champagne glass tighter, as she realized that she was now the one being judged, she was now the one under scrutiny, she was now the one whose actions were being picked apart. For the first time since she opened her mouth, Diane looked nervous. And as I stared at her, taking in the way her composure cracked, taking in the way her confidence faltered, taking in the way she struggled to maintain her usual air of superiority, I felt nothing but satisfaction. Because she had tried to break me, but instead, she had just handed me the biggest victory of my life. Her mouth opened and closed, as if searching for the right words, as if her mind was scrambling to piece together an excuse that would make this all disappear, as if she was desperate to find some way, anyway, to turn this back in her favor before she lost complete control of the situation. The room was still eerily silent, the weight of her failure pressing down on every guest, on every whispered murmur, on every judging stare directed straight at her instead of at me, which was clearly not the way she had envisioned this playing out. I watched as her grip tightened around her champagne glass, her knuckles going white, her lips parting as she stammered over words that refused to come out smoothly. I was just trying to help," she finally managed, her voice shaking slightly, lacking the usual confidence, the usual edge of superiority that she always carried, the usual cold authority that she had wielded so effortlessly over the years. But that power was slipping now, unraveling thread by thread as she stood there exposed, her entire plan crumbling around her, her carefully constructed moment of triumph turning into something humiliating, something irreversible, something that would be remembered forever. I tilted my head slightly, letting a slow smirk tug at the corners of my lips, watching as the cracks in her facade deepened, watching as she realized that she had lost and that there was no coming back from this. "You were trying to destroy my marriage," I corrected, my voice carrying the weight of every single time she had tried to manipulate situations in the past, every single moment she had attempted to twist reality to suit her own narrative, every single time she had assumed that I would never be strong enough to fight back. But this time, you didn't just fail. You humiliated yourself in front of everyone. I gestured to the guests, who were no longer looking at me with pity, who were no longer treating me as the victim, who were now whispering amongst themselves, shaking their heads, exchanging glances that told me exactly what they were thinking, that Diane had just ruined herself in a way she could never undo. Jake took a slow step forward, his posture rigid, his jaw tight with barely contained anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he finally spoke, his voice controlled but sharp, his tone laced with something dangerous, something final. "Mom, I have put up with a lot from you," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like he was finally letting himself acknowledge who she really was beneath all the fake pleasantries and manipulations. "But trying to ruin my family? Trying to humiliate Olivia at her baby shower? That's where I draw the line." Diane's eyes darted between us, her breathing uneven, her panic rising as the reality of what she had done finally set in, as she realized that there was no controlling the narrative anymore, as she realized that her perfect plan had completely backfired in real time. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to find some way to shift the blame, like she was searching for the perfect lie that would undo everything, but nothing came. Because this time, there was no lie that could fix this. This time, she had gone too far. I folded my arms across my chest, watching as Diane's face twisted in something between shock and embarrassment, as if she had genuinely never considered the possibility that she could lose control of the situation, as if the idea of her being the one humiliated had never even crossed her mind. She had walked into this baby shower expecting to break me, expecting to be the one standing tall while I fell apart, expecting to be the one who left victorious while I was left to pick up the shattered pieces of my marriage. But instead, she was standing there with her confidence in ruins, with judgmental whispers swirling around her, with every single pair of eyes in the room watching as she became the spectacle, as she became the embarrassment, as she became the one whose reputation would never fully recover from what she had just done. "You should go," I said finally, my tone calm, measured, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she had been hoping for, refusing to let her drag me down into the chaos she had tried to create. I could see the way her hands trembled slightly, the way her breathing was uneven, the way she was struggling to keep her head held high despite the fact that she had just lost every ounce of power she thought she had. "Before this gets even worse for you." The words hung between us like a warning, like a final chance for her to walk away before she made things even harder on herself, before she dug herself into an even deeper hole, before she let her pride push her into doing something even more disastrous. For a second, I thought she might argue, thought she might dig her heels in, thought she might try to spin one final lie in a desperate attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left. But instead, she swallowed hard, her throat working like she was forcing down 1,000 words she wanted to say, turned sharply on her heel, and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floors, the sound of her retreating footsteps cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Her face was burning red with humiliation, her shoulders stiff with barely contained rage, and even though she didn't say a single word as she walked away, I could feel the anger radiating off of her, could see the way she was barely keeping herself together, could tell that this was not the outcome she had expected. The second the door closed behind her, sealing her outside, a stunned silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, as if everyone was still trying to process what had just happened, as if they couldn't quite believe that Diane had actually just done that, as if they were waiting for anyone, to be the first to break the tension. And then, after a beat, Jake let out a short, disbelieving laugh, running a hand down his face, shaking his head like he was trying to wrap his mind around the absolute disaster that had just unfolded. "Well," he muttered, his voice dry, his exhaustion evident in every syllable, "I guess that's the last time she'll be invited to anything." And just like that, the tension shattered, breaking apart into relieved laughter, into quiet murmurs of support, into a warmth that had nothing to do with Diane's presence, but everything to do with the people who truly mattered. The people who stayed, the people who rallied around me, the people who had just witnessed something unbelievable, yet completely expected. Diane had thought she could ruin my life in one afternoon, thought she could make me the outsider, thought she could turn this day into something painful and unforgettable. But all she had really done was ensure that she was the only one who would be remembered for this, and not in the way she had hoped. As soon as Diane stormed out, the air in the room shifted, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders, leaving behind only awkward glances, hushed murmurs, and the kind of tension that lingers after an unexpected disaster. I could feel the energy changing, feel the hesitation in the way people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, see the silent exchange of looks between friends and family who weren't sure whether to address what had just happened or pretend it had never occurred. My mother, always the steady presence in my life, was the first to move, walking over to me with quiet concern written all over her face, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder, searching my expression for any sign that I was about to break. But I wasn't going to give Diane that satisfaction, wasn't going to let her ruin what was meant to be a celebration, wasn't going to let her be the one who dictated how the rest of the afternoon would unfold. I let out a deep breath, forcing a small smile onto my lips, making a conscious decision to reclaim the joy she had tried so desperately to steal from me. I glanced around the room at the still stunned guests, at the people who had come here to celebrate me and Jake and our baby, not to witness some malicious spectacle orchestrated by a bitter woman who couldn't stand losing control. "Well," I said, my voice light but firm, my tone carrying just enough amusement to let everyone know that I was still in charge of this day. "Who's ready for cake?" The words hung in the air for a second, followed by a pause that felt like the final breath before a storm clears. And then, just like that, laughter rippled through the room, hesitant at first but quickly growing into something real, something warm, something that told me I had just taken control of the narrative in a way Diane never expected. My best friend, Sarah, ever the one to break tension with humor, immediately jumped in, cracking a joke about how the drama made for an unforgettable baby shower, and suddenly, it was as if the spell had been broken, as if Diane's toxic presence had been scrubbed from the atmosphere entirely. People started moving again, picking up conversations where they had left off, whispering about her spectacular meltdown but clearly relieved that I hadn't crumbled under it, clearly recognizing that she'd been the villain in the story. She had been the one who embarrassed herself. She had been the one who had lost. I could see the shift in the way people spoke to me now, not with pity, but with admiration, not with concern, but with respect, not with uncertainty, but with a renewed sense of loyalty. Jake stayed close to me, his hand resting protectively on my lower back, his body tense in a way that told me his mind was elsewhere, his thoughts tangled in something deeper than just the immediate aftermath of his mother's failed scheme. I could tell he was furious, not just about the humiliation Diane had tried to cause, but about what it meant for our future, about what it revealed about the kind of person she truly was, about what he needed to do now that the truth was undeniable. I knew we would have to talk about it later, knew that this wasn't over, knew that Jake was about to make a decision that would change everything, knew that this moment had pushed him to a crossroads he had been avoiding for years. But for now, I wasn't going to let Diane's toxicity overshadow the love in this room, wasn't going to let her pettiness dictate how I experienced one of the most important days of my life. Right now, I just wanted to focus on the people who had come to celebrate us, the ones who truly cared, the ones who had just witnessed firsthand exactly why Diane would never have a place in my child's life. And as I looked around at the faces of those who remained, at the warmth in their eyes, at the genuine love surrounding me, I knew one thing for certain. She had lost, and we had won. That night, after the last guest had left and the house had settled into an eerie kind of silence, Jake sat across from me at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white, like he was physically bracing himself for a conversation he had been avoiding for years. The warmth and laughter that had returned to the baby shower after Diane's dramatic exit felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the heavy weight of everything her actions had set into motion, by the undeniable reality that today had been more than just an outburst, that today had been the final straw in a much larger storm that had been brewing between him and his mother for a long time. I knew that look on his face, knew that the words he was about to say weren't just reactionary anger, weren't just frustration spilling over from an emotionally exhausting day, weren't just empty threats that would fade once the initial rage passed. This wasn't about the baby shower, wasn't about the embarrassment, wasn't even about me alone. This was about a lifetime of manipulation, about a pattern of control that had poisoned every major event in his life, about the years he had spent bending over backward to accommodate a woman who had never once considered his happiness as important as her dominance. I could see it in the way his fingers twitched slightly, in the way his foot tapped restlessly against the tile floor, in the way his breathing was deep and measured, as if he was steadying himself for something final, something irreversible, something he had been wrestling with long before today, but had never been able to say out loud. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally, his voice low but certain, the weight of his frustration pressing down on every single syllable, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent far too long making excuses for someone who had never deserved them. "She's been trying to ruin our relationship since day one, and I kept making excuses, kept telling myself that she would get better, that she just needed time, that if I just set better boundaries, she would eventually respect them. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he was angry with himself for ever believing that was possible, as if he was disgusted by how much time he had wasted trying to fix something that had never been broken on his end. But this, he continued, his voice hardening, his fists clenching against the table as the memory of today replayed in his mind. Trying to humiliate you in front of everyone? Trying to break our family before our son is even born. His eyes met mine, and there was nothing but steel in his gaze, nothing but finality, nothing but the decision he had been too afraid to make before today. I'm done, Olivia. She's done. I studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt, any trace of the guilt that so often followed when people chose to walk away from toxic family members. But there was none. This wasn't just anger talking, wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction to an emotionally charged situation. This was a man who had finally reached his limit, who had finally accepted the truth that had been staring him in the face for years, who had finally realized that no amount of love or patience or second chances could change a woman who had never wanted to change. I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine, squeezing gently, grounding him in the quiet solidarity of knowing that he wasn't alone in this, that I would stand beside him no matter what, that no matter what decision he made, we would face it together. Are you sure? I asked softly, because I knew that cutting off a parent wasn't easy, that even when they had done nothing but cause pain, even when they had spent years proving they didn't deserve forgiveness, even when they had crossed every imaginable line, there was still something deeply ingrained about the idea of family that made walking away feel impossible. Jake looked at me, his grip tightening around mine, his thumb brushing absent-mindedly against my knuckles, his chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths, his eyes unwavering as he gave me the only answer that mattered. Yes, he said, without a single ounce of doubt, without a single moment of hesitation, without a single fear that he was making the wrong choice. And for the first time since Diane had inserted herself into our lives, since she had spent years poisoning every moment of joy we had built, since she had tried to ruin the family we were creating, she had finally lost. The silence didn't last long, didn't stretch into the peaceful aftermath we had hoped for, didn't give us the chance to fully settle into the weight of Jake's decision before Diane came crashing back in, refusing to let go of the control she had spent years wielding over him. Less than 48 hours after Jake cut contact, she showed up at our house, pounding on the door with a force that rattled the walls, as if she had the right to demand anything from us after what she had done, as if she was the one who had been wronged, as if she still believed she held any power here. I had expected something from her, had anticipated an emotional voicemail dripping with faux sincerity, had braced myself for an email filled with twisted logic and backhanded insults masquerading as apologies, had even imagined her calling Jake over and over until he finally picked up just to make it stop. But I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to be so brazen, hadn't expected her to march up to our home, as if she wasn't the one who had just publicly humiliated herself in front of everyone we knew. Jake answered the door before I could, his entire stance immediately rigid, his patience already worn thin, his tolerance for her theatrics completely gone. His body blocked the entrance like a wall, his posture unyielding, his face unreadable, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked at his mother not with frustration or forced patience, but with something closer to indifference, something colder, something final. Leave, he said before she could even open her mouth, his voice firm, his tone carrying none of the warmth that had once softened his words for her, none of the hesitation that had always kept him tethered to the hope that she could change. But Diane was nothing if not persistent, nothing if not unwilling to accept a reality where she wasn't in control, nothing if not the kind of woman who refused to acknowledge when she had lost. She took a step forward, her eyes flickering to me with something sharp and accusing, as if I was the reason her son had turned against her, as if I was the one who had orchestrated all of this, as if she could still convince him that I was the enemy. Jake, please, she said, her voice trembling, but it wasn't sadness, wasn't remorse, wasn't the grief of a mother who had realized she had pushed too far. It was frustration, it was anger, it was her realizing that she had finally lost control, that he wasn't bending for her anymore, that this wasn't going to be like all the other times when he had eventually caved under the weight of her guilt trips and emotional blackmail. I was just trying to protect you, she insisted, the words coming out rushed, desperate, like she was clinging to the last possible argument she could make, like she was grasping for a version of reality where she was still the mother who knew best, where he was still the son who would listen. Jake let out a bitter laugh, the sound short and humorless, his fingers dragging down his face before he shook his head, as if he couldn't believe she was still standing here, still trying to spin this into something noble, still refusing to acknowledge what she had done. "Protect me?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman who had spent years trying to dictate every part of his life. "Mom, you tried to destroy my marriage. You lied, you humiliated Olivia. And for what? Because you can't stand the fact that I love her more than I care about whatever twisted version of family loyalty you think I owe you." Diane flinched, just barely, just enough that I saw it, just enough that, for a second, just a brief moment, I thought I saw something close to real emotion flicker across her face. Regret, maybe, or realization, or some quiet understanding that she had finally pushed too far, that this wasn't just another fight she could manipulate her way out of, that this wasn't going to end with Jake offering her another undeserved second chance. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same cold selfishness that had driven her actions for years, the same unshakable belief that she was right and we were wrong, the same refusal to accept that she had just destroyed the only real relationship she had left with her son. And as I watched her standing there, fists clenched, face burning with frustration, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. She had spent years trying to make me feel like I didn't belong, trying to convince Jake that I wasn't good enough, trying to break us apart because she couldn't stand the idea of him choosing me over her. But in the end, all she had done was push him away. All she had done was show him exactly who she really was. All she had done was prove that she had never deserved the loyalty he had given her for so many years. And no matter what she said next, no matter how much she begged or demanded or threatened, there was one thing she couldn't change. She had already lost. Diane didn't argue after that, didn't launch into another desperate plea, didn't try to spin one last lie to justify her behavior, didn't attempt to claw her way back into control of a situation that had already slipped completely from her grasp. Maybe she finally understood that she had no ground left to stand on, that no amount of guilt-tripping or manipulation could undo the damage she had caused, that Jake wasn't going to bend this time, that her son had finally reached his limit and wasn't going to let her poison his life any longer. Or maybe it wasn't understanding at all. Maybe it was just pure, unfiltered rage at the realization that she had lost, that her power over him had crumbled, that she had done this to herself and had no one else to blame. Either way, she didn't say another word, didn't make another dramatic attempt to force herself back into our lives. She simply turned on her heel, her shoulders stiff with barely contained anger, her entire body radiating resentment as she stormed down the steps and toward her car, her silence somehow louder than any excuse she could have given. I watched as she yanked the driver's side door open, her movement sharp and jerky, her face set in an expression so rigid it was almost unreadable, as if she was desperately trying to keep herself from unraveling completely. She slammed the door shut behind her, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, but she didn't start the engine right away, just sat there for a long moment, staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched, her breathing uneven. I wondered if she was still trying to convince herself that we were the ones in the wrong, if she was running through every interaction we had ever had, trying to find a version of the story where she was the victim, where she was justified in everything she had done. But it didn't matter what she told herself now, didn't matter how she tried to twist this in her own mind, because the truth was undeniable, the consequences of her actions were permanent, and this time, there was no coming back from it. As the sound of her car engine roared to life, as her tires screeched slightly against the pavement, as she drove off into the night, I felt something I hadn't expected, something that settled deep in my chest, something that wrapped around me like the first breath of fresh air after being trapped for years. Peace. It was sudden and complete, washing over me in a way that almost made me lightheaded, a release of tension I hadn't even realized I had been carrying for so long. It was the absence of fear, the absence of anxiety, the absence of the constant, looming weight of her presence in our lives. It was the realization that she was gone, that she no longer had power over us, that she had finally lost. Jake closed the door with a quiet finality, leaning against it for a moment before letting out a slow, heavy breath, the kind that sounded like he had been holding it in for years, the kind that carried the weight of a lifetime of exhaustion, the kind that signified something ending. He ran a hand down his face, his fingers dragging over his jaw, his body still for a long moment before he spoke, his voice quiet but certain, almost as if he was saying it more for himself than for me. "That's it," he murmured, barely above a whisper, his eyes still fixed on the door as if expecting her to burst back in at any second. But she wouldn't. Not this time. Not ever again. That's really it. I stepped closer, closing the space between us, wrapping my arms around him, pressing my forehead against his, letting the warmth of his body anchor me in the reality of this moment, in the knowledge that we had won, that we had freed ourselves from the cycle she had trapped him in for so long. Are you okay? I asked softly because even though Diane had been cruel, even though she had done nothing but hurt him, even though this was right, I knew that this moment mattered, that cutting off a parent, no matter how toxic, was still loss, still grief, still something that carried an emotional weight even when it was the right thing to do. Jake pulled me closer, his arms tightening around me, his grip strong, steady, certain, no hesitation in the way he held me, no doubt in the way he pressed a kiss against my hair, no fear in the way he exhaled and let go of everything that had come before this moment. I am now, he said, his voice firm in a way that told me he meant it, in a way that told me he wasn't looking back, in a way that told me this was not just relief, it was freedom. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other, surrounded by the quiet stillness of a house that finally felt like ours, I knew with absolute certainty that our future, our family, would be stronger without her in it. Diane didn't come to the hospital when our son was born, didn't send flowers or a congratulatory message, didn't call to ask how we were doing, didn't acknowledge the fact that she had lost the privilege of being in our child's life. There was no dramatic last-minute attempt to mend things, no emotional plea to be forgiven, no sign that she had even considered trying to repair the damage she had caused. And the truth? We didn't miss her, didn't sit around wondering if she would ever come around, didn't waste time mourning the absence of someone who had never brought anything but stress and manipulation into our lives. Our son was surrounded by real love, by people who truly cared, by a family that wasn't built on control and selfishness, but on warmth and kindness and unconditional support. He had grandparents who adored him, aunts and uncles who cherished him, friends who would grow up alongside him, knowing only genuine affection. Diane's absence wasn't a loss, it was a blessing. Jake never regretted his decision, never looked back, never let Diane's absence feel like something that needed to be filled, never allowed even a flicker of doubt to creep into his mind about whether he had done the right thing. Instead, he focused on being the kind of father his own mother had never taught him to be, kind, patient, present, loving in a way that wasn't conditional, in a way that wasn't tangled in expectations or control, in a way that didn't demand anything in return. He had spent years learning what not to do, years recognizing the patterns that had made his childhood feel suffocating, years understanding that the best thing he could ever do for our son was to break the cycle before it had a chance to repeat. And every time I saw him holding our baby close to his chest, every time I watched him reading bedtime stories in a soft, steady voice, every time I caught him whispering quiet reassurances that our child would always be safe and loved, I knew without a doubt that we had made the right choice. Because in the end, Diane had tried to break us, had tried to poison our happiness, had tried to tear apart something she had never wanted to exist in the first place, had tried everything in her power to make sure she was the most important person in Jake's life. But all she had done was push us closer together, strengthen what she had hoped to destroy, reinforce the foundation she had spent years trying to crack, and in the process, she had left herself with nothing. No son who would call to check on her, no family who would include her in their milestones, no grandchild who would ever know her name beyond the stories we would one day tell. And that, in the end, was the kind of ending she had always deserved, the kind where we thrived without her, the kind where she had no one to blame but herself, the kind where the only thing she had left was regret.